In most places, a highway, a railroad, and a historic route would each take their own path. In Southern California, all three are focused into the same narrow canyon, a corridor carved by the San Andreas Fault itself. And that pressure shows. It shows in the accidents, the engineering workarounds, and the stories left behind by everyone who's moved through here. From the early auto trails and Route 66 to triple-track rail lines and I-15. This passage has carried more than traffic. It's carried decades of consequences. And today we're going to take a closer look at the fault-built gateway that Southern California has never stopped relying on. That's because today we're talking about another busy and terrible mountain pass. One that has I-15, Route 66, and the San Andreas Fault all wrapped in together. In the new series that we're calling Danger Ahead, this is the Cajon Pass, and we're going to talk about it as we go beyond the exit. Welcome to Beyond the Exit, where we like telling stories from the roads that move us. I'm Scott, and this is another episode in our Danger Ahead series. Today, we're talking about the famous, or infamous, Cajon Pass, a corridor millions of people travel every year, often without realizing just how much history, pressure, and risk moves through this one narrow canyon. Before we go too much further in our story, I want to thank the people that have helped me out here. Interstate Kyle, who is a friend of our channels. A special shout out to California Places for the drone footage of the pass. And finally, David Skelton for a wonderful look at the BNSF line in Cajon. Unfortunately, we couldn't be in California ourselves to get this footage, and they've been more than kind to share it with us. So why don't you take a moment and go take a look at their channels. I'll leave a link in the description below. Now, the challenges people see with the Cajon Pass today didn't start with the interstate, and they didn't start with the railroad. Nor did they begin with the Old Trails Highway and the famous Route 66. To understand why this canyon became such a critical gateway, and why everything still funnels through it, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the first people who found their way through this rugged corridor long before modern roads existed. The pass, known as the Box. Long before highways or rail lines, the Cajon Pass was already the only practical doorway into Southern California. Indigenous communities followed the Mojave River Trail through this narrow break in the mountains, and when Spanish explorers arrived in the late 1700s, they used the same path for mission and supply routes. It was during this period that the canyon picked up its name, El Cajon, or the Box, because the steep walls closed in around the old trail like the sides of a wooden crate. By the mid-1800s, American pioneers were moving through the pass as well. Mountain man Jedediah Smith crossed here. U.S. Army survey teams followed, mapping potential routes into the region. Even members of the Mormon Battalion pushed oversized wagons through the terrain so tight that parts had to be dismantled just to go through the narrows. Each group that moved west discovered the same truth. The land didn't offer many choices. If you were coming into Southern California from the desert, you took Cajon. As traffic increased, a local businessman named John Brown Sr. built the first engineered route through the canyon, the Cajon Toll Road of 1861. It widened sections of the trail and added switchbacks, and made the climb more reliable for freight wagons and stagecoaches. And just like every improvement that would follow, it helped only as much as the tight canyon walls would allow. Then came the railroad. In the 1880s, the Santa Fe Railway forced its line through the Cajon's steep slopes, battling grades as high as 2.2%. By the early 20th century, the canyon had become a full-time transportation corridor. Freight on the old wagon road and heavy trains on the new rail line were all squeezing through the same narrow geologic bottleneck, each finding grades, curves, and limited room to maneuver. The pass was already handling more movement than it was ever built for, wagon and rail alike, and that pressure would only grow as the next wave of travelers arrived. And then came the highway. By the early 1900s, the Cajon Pass already had its hands full. There were wagons following the old toll road, trains working their way up the grade, and all of it squeezed into the same narrow canyon. Space was limited, traffic was steady, and the pass was doing all it could to keep people moving. And then the automobile showed up. One more traveler competing for a space in a corridor that didn't have much room left to give. Early motorists didn't find an easy climb waiting for them. The first auto routes through Cajon mostly followed the wagon path, hugging the canyon floor or clinging to narrow benches where the terrain allowed. The road was rough, the curves were tight, and if something went wrong, there weren't many places to pull over. Roadside help wasn't guaranteed either, and if your car overheated or simply gave out, you handled it right there, on the grade. But that didn't stop the people from coming. By the 1910s and 20s, the National Old Trails Road and other early auto routes began stitching together a more dependable path. Engineers carved small shelves into the hillside, widened old wagon corners, and straightened a few of the dangerous bends. Careful improvements in a canyon that offered very few opportunities to make changes. It wasn't a full rebuild, but it made the climb workable for a growing number of drivers. Then came the highway that would define the pass for an entire generation. When US 66 was established in late 1926, it didn't replace everything that came before. It inherited it, so engineers went back in, blasting into the hillside, widening the existing grades and cutting fresh slices through the rock to make room for 2 or 4 lanes of pavement. Route 66 didn't remove the danger, it simply formalized the route and brought far more travelers into a space that never had much margin to begin with. Through the 1930s, the traffic grew heavier, especially during the Great Depression. Dust Bowl families heading west camped at Blue Cut, a government-run camp set in the canyon floor, resting before the final push into the Los Angeles basin. For thousands of people fleeing drought and poverty, Cajon Pass wasn't just another road, it was the last barrier before reaching the promise of California. Over the next decades, the highway shifted again and again. Curves were softened and, of course, lanes were added, and new cuts were opened as engineers tried to stay ahead of the traffic. But the canyon didn't change all that much. The walls were still tight, and the railroad still shared the same corridor, and the pass carried more vehicles every year. By the 1940s and 50s, Cajon was one of the busiest and least forgiving transportation corridors in Southern California. The rise of Interstate 15. By the late 1950s, it was clear that Route 66 couldn't carry the load anymore. Cars were faster, trucks were heavier, and the post-war boom turned Cajon Pass into a daily bottleneck. Every curve and grade that early engineers had managed to work around now worked against the traffic. There simply wasn't any more room to stretch the old highway. When the interstate highway system came along, planners didn't have many options. Cajon was still the only realistic doorway to Southern California from the high desert, and every alternative came with steeper grades or longer detours. So the new freeway, Interstate 15, would have to use the same narrow corridor that wagons, motorists, and railroads had fought over for a century. Now, I-15 didn't appear overnight. It was built in stages through the 1960s and 70s. At the base of the pass, everything squeezed together again at Devore, where I-15 and I-215 meet, an interchange that quickly became a very notorious choke point. For decades, traffic funneled through a tangle of ramps and narrow connectors that struggled to keep up with the sheer number of vehicles. The steep grades found weaknesses in everything, especially heavy trucks of the day, not to mention the wind gusts that high-profile trucks had to deal with. Fog settled into the canyon without warning, and every fire season threatened to close the road entirely. For all its lanes and modern engineering, I-15 inherited the same constant hazards that had troubled every route through this corridor. But the interstate wasn't the only thing moving through Cajon. The railroads still ran beside it, hauling some of the heaviest freight in the country. And in 1989, a runaway train proved just how quickly things in the canyon can go wrong. A runaway on the grade. In the spring of 1989, the Cajon Pass was already carrying more traffic than it was ever designed for. Rail, highway, and everything in between. But on May 12th, something far worse was about to arrive. Southern Pacific train MJL BP 11, hauling 69 cars and weighing nearly 9,000 tons, began descending the 2.2% grade towards San Bernardino. On paper, the grade doesn't sound like much, but for a train, it might as well have been a cliff. And on this morning, the crew didn't realize the train was far heavier than the paperwork claimed. This meant there weren't enough locomotives to handle the braking power to control it. As the train began dropping downhill, gravity took over. That's more than 18 million pounds, the equivalent of 3 fully fueled Saturn V rockets aimed at the city of San Bernardino. Engineers threw the brakes into full emergency, but the momentum was already overwhelming. By 7:36 a.m., the train was screaming down the grade faster than the crew could manage. Seconds later, it left the tracks. The derailment tore into the Duffy Street neighborhood, a quiet stretch of homes on the edge of town. 7 houses were destroyed instantly as trains and hopper cars plowed through their backyards. 4 people died in the crash, 2 crew members and 2 young children who lived nearby. In the days that followed, crews worked to clear the wreckage, unaware that a second disaster was silently brewing beneath their feet. A ruptured petroleum pipeline damaged in the derailment. On May 25th, nearly 2 weeks later, it ignited in a massive explosion that destroyed 11 more homes. The toll on San Bernardino was heartbreaking. 2 additional lives had been lost in the pipeline explosion, leading to a total of 7 people injured and 6 souls lost. And yet the Cajon Pass has seen its share of other rail accidents since then as well, including a 1994 collision near Highway 138 and a deadly 1996 derailment and fire. This stretch through the mountains has seen some of the worst rail accidents in Southern California history. And while danger is always lurking in everything that moves through the pass, it doesn't always come from trains or traffic. Sometimes it comes from the ground itself. The fault that formed the mountain. Cajon Pass doesn't just cut through the mountains, it cuts directly across one of the most active fault zones in North America. The San Andreas Fault runs right through this narrow corridor, carving a jagged line between the San Bernardino Mountains on one side and the San Gabriel Mountains on the other. If you've ever looked at a map and wondered why the pass sits exactly where it does, there is a reason. The mountains were pushed apart here, leaving a natural doorway and a natural weakness. For anyone traveling through the pass, the San Andreas is mostly invisible. It hides beneath the chaparral and railroad cuts, but geologists and locals know it well. It's one of the only places in California where the fault is exposed enough that you can stand there and see the break between the plates. North America on one side, Pacific plate on the other. 2 massive slabs of earth sliding past each other, inch by inch, year after year. And that slow movement, of course, adds up. The San Andreas in this area has produced major earthquakes for centuries. Quakes in 1812, 1857, and 1899 all rattled this corridor, damaging early settlements and sending rock slides down the canyon walls. Even the 1857 Fort Tejon quake, one of the largest ever recorded in the United States, tore the ground for more than 225 miles, including across the Cajon Pass region. Modern engineering has strengthened bridges and secured slopes and bolted the interstate into the canyon as best as possible. But the reality remains, this is one of California's most critical transportation lifelines, built directly atop its most famous fault. Built for millions, still unforgiving. The early trails in Route 66 carved the first path through the Cajon Pass, but Interstate 15 is the superhighway that took over the job. Today it carries everything. Commuters between the high desert and Los Angeles, families headed to Las Vegas, and more freight trucks than almost anywhere else in the region. The interstate doesn't exactly run where the original Cajon Pass once did, but it sits right beside it, climbing the same steep walls and threading the same narrow canyon. And despite decades of engineering, it's still a challenge for everyone who drives through it. The sheer volume of traffic alone through here is staggering. During peak periods, over 120,000 vehicles pass through this corridor every single day. That's almost 44 million vehicles a year. And to put that in perspective, that's nearly 3 times the number of vehicles sold in the United States in an entire year. Of that volume, 20 to 25% are heavy trucks and semis, which, due to the grades in the pass, are held to 45-mile-an-hour speed limits. It's hard to say which is worse on the trucks, the descent or the climb. Either way, the inevitable traffic gridlock on this mountain make it a challenge for a driver's skills. The state of California has poured nearly $500 million into modern upgrades over the years, widening interchanges and reinforcing slopes and rebuilding sections of the pass that simply couldn't handle the daily pounding anymore. But for all that effort, Cajon Pass stays exactly what it has been, a narrow, overworked gateway between the desert and the coast, a place where millions of commuters, thousands of big rigs, and some of the busiest freight rails in America all squeeze through the same fragile canyon, carved by earthquakes and time. The hard way in. When you look at Cajon Pass today, it's easy to see only the traffic, trucks, and the trains, and that tight squeeze of it all. But every mile of pavement and every rail bolted into the canyon walls carries a century and a half of people trying to get through this one narrow doorway between the desert and the coast. From the old wagon toll roads and the first steel rails, to the migrants who camped at Blue Cut during the Dust Bowl, to the heyday of Route 66, and now the millions who ride the I-15 every year. Cajon has never been quiet, and it has never been simple. It's a place where California's history is stacked in layers, trails on top of trails, and highways shadowing the old ones. A place sharpened by ambition, carved by engineering, and always watched over by the San Andreas Fault beneath our feet. And whether it's a runaway freight train, a wildfire rolling out of the canyon, or the everyday grind of 44 million vehicles a year, Cajon Pass reminds us of something we tend to forget. Some corridors demand respect, not because they're dangerous, but because so many lives depend on them. Well, we hope you enjoyed our story on the Cajon Pass. Maybe you're a professional driver or just a commuter, and you've got a story you want to tell. Well, leave it in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed the video, if you would, please hit the like button. That helps it go farther on YouTube, and we'd love it if you would share it with someone you think would enjoy it as well. You know, we love telling the stories from the roads that move us, and maybe that's something you enjoy too. If so, why don't you join us on this caravan and subscribe to the channel? You know, at Beyond the Exit, we're always looking for history that's just hiding in plain sight. We know you can be other places. We're happy that you're here. We want to say thank you, and God bless.